So I hope everyone's ready. There's gonna be some pictures of some not so adorable birds as well, because you know some of them aren't the prettiest, but there's gonna be a lot of really cute baby birds. So yeah, so tonight's talk is going to be all about birds, basically going from even before they're fluffy, basically going from a little bit after copulation all the way up to adulthood, talking about how they develop and some of the challenges they face throughout that entire process. So, of course, also, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or let Mary Helen know, and we can ask or answer a bunch of those at the end of the talk. So to start, really kind of basic, um, you know, after copulation, effectively what ends up happening is, right, birds start in eggs. We know that, right? So basically what ends up happening is the ovary ends up leaving, the egg basically ends up leaving the ovary. It is then fertilized. That's what we consider the yolk. As it travels down through the reproductive organs, right, you end up getting some albumin put on there, which is effectively the egg white. And effectively what's happening here is there's a bunch of layers that are being put on as it travels down through. After it gets its egg white, it starts to get more membrane layers. Once it has the membrane layers on, there's a bunch of water effectively added on. And then this calcium carbonate shell is finally deposited on the exterior. Now, this entire process takes about 24 hours, and it is complicated. I'm not going to get super in-depth about that. But it's also, of course, very important, right? So understanding how fertilization occurs and how eggs are laid is really important for us as biologists to understand what might affect this process. One of the interesting things about egg laying in particular with birds is that the wider side of the egg always comes first. There was a very interesting study back in, the 1700s, where basically somebody was trying to figure out which side of the egg always came out, and they actually went up into the cloaca, and this doesn't sound particularly pleasant, but made a mark with a pencil, and they were able to determine that this one side is always coming out first. Really fascinating study. Not particularly, I feel like, ethical at this point in time, but you know, back in the day, it was what it was. So one of the last things that gets added on to the eggs before it comes out is pigmentation. So there are a lot of really pretty eggs. Here is a collection of eggs that is actually from Audubon's historic house, some of the eggs that he collected. Eggs, I think, are really fascinating. They are one of those things that you kind of take for granted. When you see it, it's just kind of an egg, but it is something that is just a little pocket full of embryo, basically. You can have really tiny eggs. The Vervain hummingbird has a 10-millimeter egg, which is smaller than your fingernail, so very small. You have obviously really large eggs. So ostrich eggs, of course, are huge. They can be about 8 inches long, which is the width of printer paper. Right? So you have this gigantic variation in egg sizes, not necessarily shape. Shape compared to reptiles, a lot of reptilian eggs tend to be spherical compared to eggs, or avian eggs just tend to be kind of more oblong. But you certainly get a lot of different coloration, and you kind of have a lot of different egg laying strategies. And one of the really interesting things is that, weirdly enough, the kiwi, that flightless bird from New Zealand, right, is the bird with the largest egg to body ratio. It's a kind of a weird thing. Most birds tend to lay eggs that are significantly smaller than them. Kiwis actually lay these eggs that are pretty significantly big for the size of the individual. And biologists aren't entirely sure why that's the case. They don't necessarily need to be that large. It might help with them being able to develop faster, is the prevailing theory, but we're still not entirely sure. So all these eggs are eggshells. These are preserved eggshells. So you can't necessarily, you can't eat these or anything like that. No, I don't think you would want to. And effectively, the way that they're basically preserved is you will basically put a pin in one side of it, and then you put a pin in the other side of it, and you blow out the yolk and the egg white and stuff like that. So it's just the eggshell which is preserved. And you can keep it, and it looks nice and pretty. So before we kind of get into embryo development, I figured I'd kind of touch on this topic really quickly. What ends up happening, right, is when birds nest and they lay their clutches and they have their broods and they go through the entire process of taking care of their young. It is a really intensive process. And that process is kind of dictated really by when you get there and how good the environment is. So survival of basically the nestlings and the fledglings, right, these chicks, is really dependent on kind of these two main hypotheses. There is the quality hypothesis, and what this basically contends is that if you are the early bird, you get the worm. If you get to your nesting spot quickly, you're going to get the best quality territory. You'll have the most food, the most water, you'll have the best shelter, and more likely than not, you are the most physically fit, right? Not necessarily, fitness when we think of fitness, but in terms of phenotypic characteristics. Maybe you have slightly longer wings, or maybe your beak is a certain shape, and that lets you have a certain food, be able to eat a certain food resource, right? So the quality hypothesis says that the birds that get there the fastest are basically the ones that end up having the best nests. And this is also kind of plays into the date hypothesis. The date hypothesis predicts that basically there's a seasonality to reproduction. So when you get there, and then when you build your nest, and then when the eggs hatch and you have your young, all of that kind of ebbs and flows along with the other phenological things that are happening, right? So the flowers are blooming, the insect biomass is peaking, right? And all of this helps to give you some food for your nestlings. But if your environmental quality degrades, then those nestlings have worse body conditions. They're usually smaller, and they don't necessarily have the flight feathers or flight muscles that other nestlings have. And so they're less likely to survive to fledge. So this is kind of these dual hypotheses in terms of what we think of when it comes to nesting. And it really does seem like, generally speaking, the earlier you get there can certainly be beneficial. But as we've also seen, if you get there too early, right, you're still contending with late frosts, which can be damaging. And you might get there either before or after when the insects are going to start to get out, and your food sources are going to get all misaligned. So it is kind of one of those things where we just don't quite know what's really dictating when birds come, other than kind of this, what we call Zugenruhe, which is a German word. It's an impulse to migrate, right? And so we think that there's this impulse that dictates that they come at a certain time, but it also kind of has to do with the overall quality of the individual. And all that's just a roundabout way of then getting to lay your eggs and get to a clutch. And so a clutch refers to the number of eggs laid within a single nest in a single brood. And so a clutch can vary between species and within species. So there are species like albatross penguins and some doves that lay only 1 or 2 eggs per clutch. That's it. They're not going to lay any more. Then you have some waterfowl species like wood ducks, which can lay much larger clutches. It can be 15 to 20 eggs in a clutch, which is a pretty good amount. And again, keep in mind that when they're laying these eggs, it's only 1 day or 1 egg per day. So if you're laying a clutch that's 20 eggs large, that's almost 3 weeks of just egg laying, which is a good amount of work. And it does kind of depend on the food and the calcium availability. There's also latitude, age of the female, weather, and the time of year, right? So some of those things are taken into account. One of the interesting things about when you're laying your clutch is that you don't necessarily have only one nesting pair's clutch in a certain nest. So with wood ducks, oftentimes you end up having what they call dump nests, basically, where you'll have one female, one male using that nest really most of the time. But when that female leaves, other females will come in there and actually lay their eggs as well. And it's almost a form of nest or brood parasitism. And so they end up getting the other female to raise their young, and it really helps in terms of energy for the adults. Not so much the female taking care of all of the chicks, but the other chicks that come and dump their eggs and then leave. And so brood parasitism is a major problem for some birds, right? So you have a brown-headed cowbird, some European cuckoo species are brood parasites, and effectively what they do is a very similar strategy. So brown-headed cowbird, right, doesn't make a nest, doesn't waste that energy making a nest. It doesn't waste its energy actually taking care of its young, really. It will lay its egg in another bird's nest, That individual egg will then hatch after incubation. And it sometimes either pushes out eggs or it outcompetes the other individuals within that nest. And basically it grows up kind of adopted, I suppose, by the other parents. Sometimes it will drive those parents to literally work to death because it's asking for so much food. And so it is one of those things where it's a very valid strategy. It seems to work very well for the cowbirds. Their population is doing pretty well. And there are ways to countermeasure that. And it does seem that birds are evolving a UV basically sight that allows them to see certain types of eggs in a different way, which is fascinating. But that research is still kind of young. Anyway, moving on past that, we do have our two different strategies from birds when it comes to egg laying. You have clutches, you have determinate clutches and indeterminate. So determinate birds are like our mourning dove here. You have killdeer, terns, and mourning doves. Killdeer lay 4, terns lay 3, mourning doves lay 2. And it's a set number of eggs. They will only lay that number of eggs per clutch. And no matter what happens to those eggs, they will not replace them. So if they lay a clutch if the mourning dove and it lays 2 eggs and something comes and eats an egg, right, then it's not necessarily going to lay another one. Now it might reclutch, which means that it might, if something comes and eats both of them, it might wait a little bit and then lay a completely new brood or clutch. And so that's something that is a little bit different. And then you have indeterminate species. And this is the majority of birds. So there's no set number here, which is why oftentimes if you look up on All About Birds or audubon.org and you look at the clutch sizes, right, they're going to be varying. If the eggs are taken or lost, then these species will continue to lay eggs until resources won't allow them to lay anymore, right? So if they will starve themselves to death, basically, trying to lay as many eggs as possible. So you have species like the northern flicker, you have chickens, which is why we can harvest eggs every single day from chickens, and house sparrows, which is frustrating. Because it'd be a lot easier if they were determinate, but because they're indeterminate, right? If you remove eggs from a house sparrow nest in the hopes to try to get them to go away, they're just going to keep laying eggs. Your best bet is just to remove the nest completely. So the reason I have flickers on here is that the way we found out some of this is by studying northern flickers. The study, effectively, scientists was letting this female lay eggs, and they would just come up every single day and take an egg out and see what happened. She laid over, basically laid 67 eggs, right? Just kept on going, which I thought was a little cruel of them after a certain point. It's like once you reach 50, I understand I'm a scientist, but once you reach 50, that's a lot of work for that female flicker. So maybe just let her nest there. But yeah, so they will continue to go for an exceedingly long amount of time. And one of the interesting things about egg laying is that some birds, when you get to incubation, some birds will incubate almost immediately, right? They will, once they lay an egg, they will start incubating that egg right then and there. Other ones will only incubate once all the eggs are laid. And the interesting thing about that is that once an egg is laid, right, let's for example say you end up having 20 eggs in your clutch, that first egg has been out there for 20 days and you're thinking without incubation, it's probably dead or something like that, but it's not. The incubation ends up basically being a catalyst for it. And so without the warmth of the incubation patch from the mother, then you're not necessarily going to start growing, right? You're not going to start developing. So here is a great picture of a bald eagle with an incubation patch. It is a really cool adaptation because feathers, as we know, are really great for birds. They're fantastic. They do a great job of allowing them to fly, obviously, but not incubating, insulating them. So it keeps them warm during really cold winters or when they're flying really high up with strong winds, right? It gets really cold up there. So they need those feathers to help insulate them and keep them warm. But what that also does is it means that they don't transfer heat that well. And if you're trying to grow eggs and you need to heat them up to speed up development and kind of act as the catalyst to get these eggs going, then you need to lose those feathers so that your skin can actually touch those eggs. So that's really what the incubation patch is. Right? It just allows those feathers to molt off so that you can touch your eggs and actually warm them up. Okay? Um, there's really interesting studies that show that there's actually special nerves on there, so they can detect the temperature to basically a tenth of a degree. And so they can really dictate how warm those eggs are, so they don't get too hot, they don't get too cold. But it is a really hard time in the life of parental birds because you are just sitting there for long periods of time, which makes you pretty vulnerable to predators, especially if you're like this loon here, right? And you're just sitting on this nest that's kind of just floating in the wetlands. Um, you just, you're vulnerable. It's hard. Um, and so some birds tend to incubate kind of quickly. You know, if you're a smaller songbird, like a cardinal or general passerine species, right? It can take maybe 1 to 2 weeks. So minimizing how long it takes to develop that egg. But if you are something like a penguin, it takes 1 to 2 months. So it takes a very long time, which makes sense because it's cold, usually where penguins are, and it takes a while to warm up that egg. And so precocial birds do incubate longer. And I'll talk a little bit more about what precocial birds versus altricial birds are in just a second. But think about it like this, right? If you come out and you are really fluffy and you can walk and stuff like that, you're precocial. If you come out and you're, you know, bald and you have no feathers and you can barely open up your eyes, you're altricial. And so most songbirds are altricial because the fact that they don't incubate as long, right? So they don't develop as long, which means that they kind of come out and they're underdeveloped compared to precocial birds, which incubate longer, which means they can develop more in the egg. The parents have to be really good and attentive here because they have to allow air and waste to do kind of the membrane exchange within the egg, right? So they have to turn the eggs, they have to rearrange them so everything is getting the right amount of heat. There's a lot of work going on for these adult birds when they're incubating. So it is a stressful time. And what's happening inside the egg is needlessly complicated. So I'm not going to go super in depth here. If you are interested in how the embryo develops in the egg, you should definitely Google it and look it up. It's a really fascinating process. It's of course mirrored with human embryo development, as well as pretty much every vertebrate embryo develops very similar, right? The way a fish, a bird, a lizard, and a human kind of start to look after a certain period of time are very similar. And then of course we differentiate because we don't get wings or a beak. And so time does differ between species, right? Like we talked about, if you're a passerine species or a songbird, 1 to 2 weeks, you're really booking it here. If you're a penguin, it's going to take a much longer time. But essentially, after the first couple of days here, this first row is days 3 basically through 5. Right, you do start to develop your actual organs. You start to develop things like your brain, things like your heart, things like your eyes. Right, they start to basically develop a little bit. They're not fully developed, of course, but they do start to kind of go. By the time you're reaching the second week period, you are already having to have things like beak, scales, claws, and feathers. Right, so those start to form a little bit later. And you can kind of see here in the second row, right, your vital organs are already starting to basically develop. Then by the end of day 9, you're starting to kind of have your wings and you're starting to have your feet, and it starts to basically look like a baby bird. Admittedly, a not super attractive baby bird, but a baby bird nonetheless. And, and so you can actually monitor this in eggs. Scientists do that by candling. We basically hold a tube up with a light source behind it, and you can see the embryo develop in an egg. I wouldn't suggest doing that for anything other than pet chickens. It's not great to touch wild eggs, of course. But when I was doing research studies down in South Carolina with wood ducks, we wanted to look at how embryos develop and stuff. So you candle these eggs, and you can see this development. It's super fascinating. Yeah. And finally, the big day, you want to hatch, right? So you want to get out of that egg. It's a little cramped in there. If you want to continue to grow, right, you have to hatch. And so you end up having this basically an egg tooth, is what they call it, and this special muscle on the back of your head that allows you to puncture an egg, because eggs are actually pretty tough, especially if you're a baby inside of one. It's really tough to get out of there. So you puncture through it, and then weirdly enough, you think it'd be kind of random, but weirdly enough, most birds have developed to peck the outside and basically make a hole going counterclockwise. It's called piping or pipping, and Most birds do it. There's some wading birds that split the side open and they just kind of just go walk on out. But weirdly enough, most birds have developed the ability to just start and go counterclockwise. And it doesn't take super long. They can usually hatch, well within a day, usually within a couple hours. It just depends on how developed the embryo is and how developed that muscle is for them to be able to do it. And at this point, they are breathing atmospheric air. They are releasing waste not into any kind of embryonic sac or through any membranes or anything like that. So at this point, right, they actually start to look like baby birds, which is great because baby birds are adorable. So here is the difference between our altricial and our precocial. The altricial is our nest-loving, right, or nidocolulous birds. They are the ones that are from our songbirds, our passerine species usually, and they are really helpless. They really can't do anything. They don't fly, they don't have feathers, their eyes are closed or almost completely closed. They rely solely on their parents to take care of them. They need their parents to feed them. What they can do is beg, and you might hear chicks beg for food. But other than that, generally speaking, they really can't do much. But that's okay, because all their time is spent basically developing. Right? On the flip side of it, you get precocial birds. So precocial birds are what they call kind of nest fugitive birds. Right? These are birds that are born ready to go. And traditionally, these are ones, if you think about shorebirds, some wading birds, usually a lot of our pelagic birds are precocial. So they are covered in down. They're super cute, right? This is the pictures of the plovers and the killdeer and stuff like that, right? And their eyes are open. They are able to walk and swim almost immediately. Well within a couple hours, they can get out and start to move around and explore their world. And that is a big benefit to them. But again, usually that's because they've had longer time to develop inside the egg. So they are able to develop their muscles and their feathers a little bit further compared to the altricial individuals. And part of it also is the fact that usually these individuals, right, they don't necessarily have the most developed nests. So if you think about a tern that has a nest that's really just a scrape in the sand, right? A scrape, it's a little bit deep, and then you have your eggs right in there. So they need to get moving because they don't have a lot of protection from predators, right? A fox, a snake, whatever can come up and eat them. An artificial bird is going to be a lot more protected, right? If you're in a nest box, maybe a snake can get in there, but you're usually protected from foxes. You're usually protected from other bigger birds. They're not going to be able to get in there. So you have the ability to develop more and stay in your nest safer compared to a precocial bird, which really isn't safe where it is. It needs to be able to run around and move. So once you're born, everybody needs to eat, right? And they need a lot of food. Baby birds are hungry. They are constantly having to be fed. And they can be fed multiple times each hour, right? So here's our robin feeding, kind of a classic example here, feeding some chicks and worms. And they really need protein, right? Even if a bird is not necessarily a big protein eater as an adult, at this stage in its life, it needs as much protein as possible. It needs to eat a lot of protein to grow. And obviously, right, when you think about muscle and feather development, it needs that protein to make those things. So for terrestrial species, the big ones are caterpillars and worms. Caterpillars are huge. If you come to our talk by Doug Tallamy, or if you just want to ever look up Doug Tallamy, he talks about the importance of caterpillars. And they're extremely important. They help to basically act as food sources for a lot of these birds. And by having a bunch of caterpillars and a diverse array of caterpillars in your yard, you're helping to provide food for birds. But other birds, prothonotary warblers that live in flooded bottomland hardwood forests, or your wood ducks, right? They're going to eat a lot of other things. They can eat mayflies or benthic macroinvertebrates. They would obviously still eat caterpillars and worms if possible, but they're a little bit less likely to get those. So they might have to get their protein from a different direction. But pretty much universally, they're going after invertebrates and eating a bunch of bugs. They don't typically tend to feed their young any kinds of grains or seeds or anything like that. And unfortunately, that is kind of a problem because as climate change continues to occur, what we see is that all the timing that has evolved over thousands of years is getting really out of whack because anthropogenic causes, of course, are causing climate change, and it's causing climate change to happen really fast, right? So even though it seems kind of slow to us, it's really fast in evolutionary terms. Um, and so what ends up happening is our birds have learned to migrate to take advantage of certain food resources, right? Think about the red knots and horseshoe crabs, right? They are really well adapted to get there at the peak spawn of horseshoe crabs, and they can eat all those green eggs, right? The same thing happens with most of our other bird species. They are evolved to get here, make their nest, and have their nestlings hatch and have peak food requirement right when insect biomass is the most. So when there's the most insects out there, they are ready to feed their young, all those caterpillars. But if climate change causes plants to bloom earlier, and this is what we're seeing, right? You tend to see these plants blooming a little bit earlier. Then the insects, because the way insects are, they evolve very quickly. They basically have learned to start to reproduce faster. They get going a little bit faster, and their peak biomass, this top of the A point, right, is shifts up a little bit more. So instead of it being in late April, it starts to be in early April. And then the birds aren't necessarily super well adapted or able to adapt that well to meet that change. So what ends up happening is the insect biomass is up, then they die off, and the birds aren't able to take advantage of that. And they can't feed their nestlings as much food as they need. So what we've seen is typically smaller clutches, maybe, certainly lower nestling survival. You see worse body condition overall for nestlings, and potentially them being able to take, if possible, different food sources, or if not, then you just end up having nestlings and fledglings die, unfortunately. So it is a major issue. Of course, habitat destruction is also a major issue. If you don't have a place to nest, um, then that's a major issue. But having your food source not available is a big problem. So this is definitely something that we really try to keep in mind here, and it's something that we need to consider as we move forward. But it's not all doom and gloom. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Um, so for chicks and nestlings, it is a hard life the first week. It is difficult, right? So altricial birds, they are really just sitting around and begging and eating. They move around a little bit, but it's cramped in that nest, and if they move around too much, they're going to fall out potentially, and that's of course a problem. They really lack the muscles and feathers to get moving. Precocial birds have it really hard. They're going to start to learn to feed themselves, and they're going to explore, like I said, but they really need to stay close to their parents because they are a favorite food source for just about everything. Everything wants to eat a baby bird. Whether it's a snake, or like I said, a fox, or a snapping turtle waiting for a duck to have their ducklings swim overhead. It's unfortunate, but it is the way nature works, right? Because that helps to feed other babies as well. So these little guys, they really do have a hard time of it. So they really do have to learn to run and understand where predators are pretty quickly. But it's not just the outside world that wants to make things hard. It's their siblings as well. Of course, those of us who have siblings know this all too well. It can be a little bit challenging sometimes. I love my brother, but sometimes it was a little bit hard living in the same house. So regardless of relatedness, siblings will compete for resources. And what I mean by that is that birds will have extra paired copulations. What that means is the male will go off and they'll copulate with the female, and then they'll go, okay, I'm gonna go get some food. And then other males will come and also copulate with that same female. And so what you'll have is a bunch of basically step brothers and sisters all in the same nest. So they're all mostly, well, they all are related to the female, unless you have brood parasitism from those cowbirds. But they're not all from the same father. And regardless of that, right, they're all going to compete with each other all the time. They just always do. And if we've seen, if you have only one egg in the nest, right? If you were to have a barn swallow or a tree swallow or whatever, and you take out all the eggs except for one, that individual is going to grow really big. It's going to grow, it's going to develop a little bit faster, and it's going to have a higher chance of survival. Um, if you leave all the eggs in the nest and you have siblings, generally speaking, you have smaller body mass and a lower survival rate. And that just makes sense because you only have two parents, and those parents have to bring you food. And if you're distributing that food among three compared to one, right, you're not necessarily going to be able to eat as much as you could otherwise. And so what we've seen is that there's these really interesting studies that show that siblings can be honest or they can be liars, just like in humans, right? Um, so when baby birds are acting like this, right, they're begging with their mouth wide open, right? So they're begging for food. And even though we can't hear it, there is a lot of subtle differences in these begging. So sometimes the begging will say, you know, I'm really, really hungry, or sometimes it's just, oh, hey, you're back. You have some food, I'll eat some of that. But if not, that's okay. You can give it to my sibling over here because they're also very, very hungry. So if you're honest, right, then you can say, okay, well, I'm not the hungriest right now. I just ate a delicious mayfly. You can have that caterpillar over to my brother over here. That's fine. Sometimes though, you have siblings who are liars and they say, you know what, I'm starving all the time. I know I just ate a caterpillar, but you might not remember that you just gave me a caterpillar, so I'll take another caterpillar, please. Thank you so much. And the interesting thing about that, right, is that sometimes it can backfire because parents will learn sometimes that the individual is lying and they will actually feed them even less than the other siblings that are honest. So it's a cost benefit analysis of, do I think I can be a good liar and get away with getting more food from my parents? Or should I really tell the truth and maybe, you know, share with my siblings? I tend to be a share with my siblings kind of person. But you know, it's a dog eat dog world out there in the natural world. So it is understandable if you want to sit there and say, you know, I want more caterpillars, please. And this is the last graph that I'll show. So don't get too worried about that. I'm gonna get back to the cute birds in a little bit. Nestlings do grow really rapidly, right? They're being fed a lot, and that food is being turned into muscle and into feathers and things like that. So they can double their body weight every 1 to 2 days for the first few weeks, right? So if you look here, we have our days 1 through 10, or 0 through 10. So they hatch, they're maybe, let's say, 2.5 grams. By day 2, they're well over 5 grams. By day 4, right, they're starting to get to be about 8. By day 6, you're looking at around 14. 8, you're looking at around 16. And then by day 9, it's right around maybe 18, 19 grams, right? So they really do put on a lot of weight. It's easier when you're really small to be able to start to double your body mass. And you're really growing a lot. Now, this typically is what we've seen in mostly altricial birds. Precocial birds do tend to have a little bit slower development once they reach basically this stage because they are spending more of that energy. So altricial can just sit there and wait and eat and eat and eat and really just develop their muscles and feathers and not have to worry about doing anything else. If you're precocial, you have to worry about running around and following your parents and wanting to hide away from a storm and running away from a snake. So you're spending more energy. So their growth rate is a little bit smaller, a little bit lower. And of course, right, this is all dependent on resource availability, parental care, and sibling competition. So parental care is challenging as well, of course. So if you lose a parent, it is devastating usually for a nest. Not to say, of course, that all the individuals will die, but if you lose a parent, usually that does mean that the body condition is going to decrease, and there is a greater chance of mortality. There are some species, if you were here with when I was talking about crows and ravens and corvids, then you know that the crows will actually have helpers that will take care of the nest. So if a parent dies, the helpers are all from the father's side, and they will step in and help to take care of the young. And that allows those individuals to A, get practice being a parent, because they're usually typically juveniles. B, it also allows them to get basically territory, because it helps them to then say, this is my nest and I can defend this territory and everybody else can bugger off, basically. And so it is a really rare example, though. Most species don't typically tend to have nest helpers. So within 1 to 2 weeks, nestlings are getting bigger. This is a picture from a really great resource from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that I can share out. Basically, it has 20 plus species, and it kind of goes through their first 14 to 16 days of development, and you can see it's meticulously tracking all these different things, and you can tell how old a bird is. It's really fascinating. Not the easiest reading. I wouldn't say it's a beach read, but it's definitely something that if you're interested in this, you should take a look at. So as our birds are getting older, right, if they're altricial, their eyes are finally opening. And the big thing, of course, is that the feathers are starting to develop finally for these altricial birds. Okay, so the pins are coming out. These are these kind of pointy-looking feathered parts within their first week. So all the tracks, so all the places where they should have feathers, by the end of basically the 2 weeks, they should have at least all those places covered with these pins. And then you're going to have these feathers start to unsheath. So this basically hard outer sheath is going to start disintegrating, and you're going to start to have these feathers that actually resemble feathers instead of these weird kind of comey looking things. That does take a while because feathers are, they're mostly protein, and so they need that food to develop these things. As they continue to grow, their bill starts to get bigger and kind of loses that distinctive baby bird shape after a while. It'll hang around for them until they're basically juvenile, and they'll kind of lose that yellowish beak after a while. But they really the big thing is their wings start to get much longer, and their flight feathers really start to come in, which is extremely important because birds need to fly. I guess not all birds, but most birds need to fly. And of course, their tarsus continues to lengthen or grow as well, right? So what we end up seeing is that the birds are basically just developing and getting bigger and bigger. Precocial young are still growing as well. They're developing their juvenile feathers as well, but again, it's going to take a little bit longer. So they're more in the 2 to 3 week range when we think about this stage. They're also covered in down, so they're not ever this naked, right? They're not ever this bald here. So this is a species from Europe called the spotless starling. I was reading an article and I just like this picture. So here is from day 1. It's kind of ugly, bald, fluffy thing that ends up turning into day 14, right? This is a basically fledged bird. It's not fully fledged yet. It looks like it's going to be hopping out of the nest kind of soon here. But you can really see the development, right? You can see when the feathers start to come out, and it happens really, really quickly, within 2 weeks. You go from just a couple centimeters to much longer. The tail tends to develop last because if you're sitting in a nest, you can't really develop your tail that well. So you really only start to develop your tail once you're able to start getting up and hopping around and moving a little bit more. And you can still see some of that yellowish beak that stays around a little bit for juveniles. You can still see some of the down, right? The feathers aren't perfect. They're not ready to really fly yet, but it's getting there. It's getting there. And this is a picture from a really great little booklet talking about bluebird development. So if you're ever interested in looking at bluebirds, if you have a bluebird box, or you're interested in taking and helping out with some of the bluebird things at Pickering Creek, it's a really interesting read just because it talks all about bluebirds. And so at this point for altricial nestlings, 3 to 4 weeks, almost about a month, they are getting ready to fledge. They are hopping around, they're really active, and they have their juvenile feathers out. So you can see, right, it's not necessarily the most attractive, but they'll get the job done. They are able to fly small distances with these. Precocial nestlings still have their down, but the juvenile feathers are really coming in, and they're spending less and less time with their parents and siblings. They still spend a lot of time, but not as much. Altricial nestlings are still spending most of their time with their siblings and parents. Right. Here's what I call colloquially Birdie Sanders, just because it reminds me of him for some reason. I don't know why. But at this point, this individual is ready to basically leave the nest, right? This is fledging. So still again with that yellowish baby bird mouth, and that's okay. You can see here on the wing there are still some prominent sheets on those feathers, but the feathers are mostly out of them, right? So they are mostly able to use these feathers for insulation and for flight. At this point, their muscle development and their feather development is still ongoing, but it's sufficient enough for them to be able to take flight somewhat, right? They're not going to be migrating right now, but they're able to at least get out and move around enough that they can, hop up from the ground to a low branch. They can hop between branches. They can do some other things like that. So fledging can start from a few weeks after they hatch to take several months. I think some owls can take 3 months basically to fledge. So it can take a while. Altricial birds really do fledge sooner. Precocial birds tend to start flying a little bit later. I think part of that's because they can move and they can walk and they can swim. So there's not necessarily a huge need for them to start flying. But part of it also is that with the altricial birds, right? At a certain point, the parents are going to stop feeding them and they need to get out there and start feeding themselves. And some birds can reclutch or lay multiple clutches in a season, and they're kind of, edging their birds out and saying, hey, like y'all need to get out of the nest because I need to start laying more eggs. So at a certain point, they do need to get going. This is typically determined by wing length. So as the wing continues to grow, eventually it reaches a certain length where flight is actually possible for these birds. And what we typically tend to see is after the initial leap, right, they hop on out, they try to fly. Usually they're not great at it, so they go to the ground. Then they will spend the rest of their fledging period on the ground, hopping around and flying to low branches or flying into thickets, which is why thickets are really important. If you have a property, consider keeping like thickets and bushes and stuff like that, because it really helps to put the fledgling there, and they can be nice and safe as they continue to develop. And this is the time that you typically tend to get people who are worried about these birds. These birds are totally fine, right? They're totally okay on the ground. The parents are usually watching them to make sure they're not going to get eaten and stuff like that. So if you see a bird that kind of looks like this and it's hopping around and it looks like it has feathers, then just leave it there. It's fine. If you see a bird that looks like this from day 1 or day 4, that's more of a problem because they are really not suited for that, right? That might be one of those things where something can push them out of the nest, and you can, if you know where the nest is, you can put them back safely. But with these individuals, they're fine. They're okay. It's just part of their life cycle. Even young wood ducks, when they make that first initial jump out of that tree, they're okay. They're fine. They'll survive. So it is a balancing act, right? Because if you leave the nest too soon, then you're not going to have those developed flight muscles. You're going to be a weak flyer, which puts you in danger. And if you're on the ground, that's hard. That's a dangerous place to be if you're a songbird, like a hummingbird. But if you spend too much time in the nest, right, you develop stronger muscle, which is great. But you put the entire brood at risk of predation. So if a snake gets there because you're begging and it can hear that, then everybody's at risk. If a snake comes up and eats one individual on the ground, then just that one individual is at risk. The rest of the brood can scatter and run away or fly away. So it is a balancing act. And like I said before, right, if you're trying to reclutch or lay more eggs in the season, then you kind of need to get these baby birds out the door so you can lay your other eggs. This is a great picture of some terns that are fledgling from Sammy Ocher, one of our other teacher naturalists. And so it does take a lot of time and practice. Learning to fly takes a while. Becoming independent takes a while. So parents will continue to offer their support as much as possible in their protection. And it can take a while. It can take days or weeks or even months to kind of get the hang of it. But the longer it takes, the more dangerous it is, right? Until you really learn to fly on your own, it starts to be a problem. And one of course, the things that does take a while is learning how to get food. So if you are, for example, let's say a skimmer, right? You have to learn the best places to go fishing and really the right way to fish. Some of it is instinctual, some of it's learned. So learning how to get that food and being able to do that correctly is hard sometimes. So you have to learn that from your parents, and you have to learn how to fly, and you have to learn all the intricacies kind of being a juvenile, which is challenging. At a certain point, like this green heron, right, you're by yourself. Your parents say, I'm done. I'm out. I've done my duty. Go take care of yourself, please. And so even though you might look goofy, you're still juvenile. You're still in your juvenile or hatchie or first year molt. You gotta take care of yourself. And so what we see is that oftentimes if it's a species that only lays one clutch per season, the parents sometimes will just migrate out of there. They'll say, you know what, you'll be fine. Um, the migration is instinctual. You'll be okay. We're gonna head on off back down to South America because it's starting to get a little chilly out here. So some species will stay. Right? Bald eagles, you might notice you have a lot of immature juvenile bald eagles that stay around here and other areas because they don't necessarily migrate as much. You have other species that will, even the juveniles, once they kind of really become better flyers, will migrate on instinct and go and join their parents, the rest of the flock. Migration instincts are really strong. There's a really cool, interesting study on monarchs that shows that, and I know it's not a bird, it's a butterfly, but just to talk about migration, when they're flying from Canada down south over Lake Superior, they go straight down and then they reach a certain point and they basically hook right and then go back down more. And scientists were really baffled by this. We weren't really quite sure. And our best guess seems to be the fact that there used to be something blocking that. There used to be basically maybe potentially some kind of mountain or hill or something that basically would have prevented them from going straight down, right? So what they ended up doing was learning this pattern of going down, going right, and then going back down again. And so that stuck with them because the ones that survived were the ones that learned that pattern. The ones that didn't make it. And so you have these really interesting migratory instincts that tell these animals when to go and how far to go and the path to travel and where to stop and yada, 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 right? Which is why it's so challenging with climate change. This is a juvenile indigo bunting. It looks a little goofy, I know, but you can kind of see, right, that it does have some of that blue. At this point in their life, right, these first year juveniles, they are completely self-sufficient, but I wouldn't call them adults yet. They still have their first year plumage and molts. And so for some species like our indigo buntings, by the end of their first year, right, so they're born in the summer or the spring, they make it to the spring, and well into the second summer, they're really just indigo buntings, they're adults. Others, like eagles and gulls, can take years. Right, so laughing gulls can take 4 years to reach that adult plumage that we know of. So there's all these different molts and plumage that you get in between them. And the really, of course, the main key to becoming an adult is reproducing in the wild world. So being able to reach sexual maturity is one thing. Being able to actually reproduce successfully is entirely different. So some species like American crows can take 2 to 4 years, bald eagles can take 4 to 5 years to reach sexual maturity. But even then, you have to be able to find a territory, defend a territory, attract a mate, which means you have to usually have a good song. For many species, that takes a while to learn their song and to practice it to be within milliseconds of perfection to attract a female. And so it usually takes a number of years before they can reproduce, which means it's really a while before they're actually adults. But at this point, they're mostly adults, right? So by the time you reach your first year of life as a indigo bunting or a cardinal or something like that, you're really basically an adult, even if you haven't had a nest and a clutch successfully. You're kind of there. You're on the precipice, which is great because surviving to this stage is really, really hard. Right? We've talked about all the development, all the things that they have to do, but it's really hard to live like that. So survival for nests and nestlings and fledglings and juveniles and everything like that, their survival rate's much lower compared to adults. So, for example, our common egret here, right? The mortality rates for the juveniles and just the juveniles in the first years is around 70 to 76% each year, right? Which means that, you know, if you even survived one summer, you're still going to potentially be in trouble. But by the time you reach adulthood, your mortality rate drops significantly. So by the time you reach an adult, there's only a 26 to 29% chance that you're pretty much going to die any year. Which sounds high, but it's really not that high when you think about wildlife. And so you really want to become an adult. You want to get there quickly. You really want to sprint. You don't want to enjoy your childhood as much because it's going to be hard to live like that. So if you can reach adulthood sooner, you can have a much higher survivability. And what we've seen is that, interestingly enough, Compared to humans and many mammals, fish and birds are really well adapted for living a very long time. There is an example right now of Wisdom the albatross, right? I think she's close to 70 or something like that. She's laying her 39th clutch successfully, as far as we can tell, and she's still going strong. And it's really fascinating, right? Usually there is a knockoff when it comes to mammalian species, right? So you reach a certain age, and then you kind of your muscle mass decreases, you can't reproduce as well, and everything like that happens. With birds and fish, we don't tend to see that as much. Same thing even with reptiles. So birds, you can be 70 years old, and if anything, you've gained more experience. You typically don't tend to lose muscle mass. You're still molting and everything fine. You have a really good idea of what territories you want to go back to. You have really good nest fidelity, so you can know where you want to go nest. You know where all the food is. You have your song pitch perfect. You know exactly how to attract mates. If anything, you're a catch, right? You are the ones that everyone wants to be with. So for birds, surviving to adulthood is the goal, and then once you reach adulthood, you are usually set. You are good to go. So it is kind of one of those things where the early part of the life is hard, but reaching adulthood is great. So most nests will have one or two survivors, but many nests don't really survive at all, and that can be because of predation. So that's snakes. You can have gulls, for example, coming in and taking eggs. It can be due to environmental factors like floods or forest fires. And that death of parents or lack of parental care, right? That's a big one too. And so all three of those are really big ones, unfortunately, that can be problems. Like I mentioned numerous times, right? If the clutch is lost early enough, you can reclutch typically. So if the clutch is lost after a week or two, then you can relay, and you are usually okay doing that. If the clutch is lost really late in the season, it can be challenging because you can relay, but then you're not going to have the food availability, and it does become a problem. So really quickly, I know we're running out of time here, so I don't want to take up everyone's night too long. Last two things we're going to talk about are kind of things that y'all can do if you want to participate in some of this. So here's a picture of a tree swallow I took at Pickering, building a nest. It's one of the tree swallows are my favorite to photograph. They're just beautiful. So if you've never heard of this organization, it's called Nest Watch. It's basically associated with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who are fantastic. It is a community science initiative, and it's really, really easy to use. Basically, you go through like a little hour-long, and even training session, and they kind of show you what they're looking for. And then you go out and you find bird nests, or you look in bird boxes, or wherever you find bird nests, and you just monitor them every couple of days. You take down some notes. How is the nest looking? What species do I think it is? Are there eggs in there? How many eggs? And then as they hatch, how many eggs hatched? How many eggs didn't hatch? All that kind of stuff. And you don't have to do it every single day. You can do it twice a week. Then you take that information and you go back and you put it in the website, or they have a mobile app, which makes it even easier because you can just do it right out there in the field. And then they take all that data and they basically are just trying to see what's been happening with nests and birds reproducing. And so there's a lot of scientific papers. A lot of the papers I've talked about tonight have come from this data. And there's even policies that have been put into place in various states and things like that based off of this information. So it's really important. And it's something that scientists, we really need that information. Right? When I was doing studies down in South Carolina, I could get to maybe a dozen or maybe if we were on a really good day, 2 dozen wood duck boxes within a 10 or 12 hour span, right? And you're going out there and you're reporting all this information, it takes a while. So having hundreds, if not thousands of people going out and helping you really assists us to be able to determine what's going on with these birds, because it's really important, right? It's really good to know. And there's also the Maryland Breeding Bird Atlas. So I'll actually let Mary Helen talk about this if she would like to.
Sure. So some of you may have attended the Breeding Bird Atlas training that took place last month. That was led by Ron Ketter, who is our organizer in Talbot County. But we are in the 3rd Breeding Bird Atlas for the state of Maryland, and in the 2nd year. So this is a really fantastic way to contribute to really rich data source for the state, as you are birding and e-birding. And so it's just about learning, first connecting to the Breeding Bird Atlas portal on eBird, and then learning what behaviors to look for. And that can include breeding behavior and finding nests and all sorts of good things. So I'll put the link to the Maryland Breeding Bird Atlas in the chat. And if you are interested or want to learn more, feel free to let us know, because we will connect you with Ron, who is the leader in Talbot, and he can share the training with you. And if you are not in Talbot County, we're happy to connect you with Ron, and he can point you in the direction of the person that you should get in touch with in your county. So
Thanks. And so yeah, both of these two community science initiatives are really, they're really great ways to, one, if just get better at birding, so it helps you to bird better. But two, it also helps scientists and researchers get some more information and data, so we can figure out who's doing what and where, basically, which is really important for us. So that's the end of my spiel here. So if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. I'll try my best. I'm not necessarily the biggest expert on some of these things. So if I don't know something, I'll try to direct you in the right way, hopefully.
All right, well, we have a question from Camille. Camille, do you want to unmute and ask?
Sure. I think it was at the very beginning that you were talking about the two birds, the one that likes to stay in the nest and be fed, overfed, and then the one that runs away.
Uh-huh.
What evolutionary thing, which one lives longer or has a better potential to survive? It's funny that they have these two different ways of growing up.
That's a great question. So I don't necessarily think, well, okay, so generally speaking, the precocial species are going to be the ones that live longest. Okay. Those tend to be your albatrosses, your eagles, and your owls and things like that. So they typically tend to be ones that are just going to live long. That's not to say that their mortality rate isn't as high necessarily. So both kind of strategies are totally valid. It just is that the altricial birds, the ones that these little baby robins, they are able to kind of survive mostly because the parents can really take care of them that much more. The precocial birds, I think it's mostly just because of the fact that they don't really make those nests, and the ones that even do, they still can potentially be challenged taking care of birds that are going to get much bigger. So feeding a almost fledged osprey is a lot of work. Feeding 3 almost fledged osprey is really, really hard work. That's a lot of fish you got to catch, plus fish for yourself. I wish I could catch that much fish in a day. Yeah. So feeding, baby robins and stuff like that is still a lot of work. But because they get out of the nest that much quicker, right, you don't have to do it for as long. So the chances of them dying isn't going to be as high. So they're both very valid. The precocial does seem to be for species that do tend to live a little bit longer.
I see.
And so it's just depending on really if you have a nest and you are able to protect your young, or they need to just get going that much faster.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I hope I answered your question. I kind of
yes, you did. It's complicated.
It is. It really is. It really is. It's fascinating. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
Maura, did you have a question?
Yeah, real quick question. Again, it was in the very beginning. Harrison, catbirds, are they bad birds? I mean, did you say that they steal nests from or that's magpies, but they steal nests or drop their eggs off for other birds to raise?
So brown-headed cowbirds, I wouldn't call them bad birds. If anything, I would give it to them. I think it's a fantastic strategy. It's a great adaptation because it means that you don't have to make a nest. You don't have to take care of your young. So you are less likely to die trying to take care of and feed everything, you're not putting as much energy into there, right? So imagine being able to basically have kids but not having to actually take care of the kids.
Right.
That's not bad. So I wouldn't call them bad birds. I think it's a really good adaptation that they've developed to take advantage of other birds.
Okay, so this is a cowbird only then?
For us, yes. There's a lot of different brood parasites. So there are some cuckoos out in Europe and things like that. But yeah, brown-headed cowbirds are kind of the local example I always use with kids when it comes to that, because they are kind of, once you start to see a brown-headed cowbird, you do tend to see them frequently around here. You kind of like, oh, okay. I often, when I first started birding, I always got them confused with grackles for some reason. I don't know why. It's just what it was. But
So what do? They literally just dump their eggs at somebody else's nest, or what do they do so they don't have to? And do they ever come back and check on their little children, or what?
So, basically they will wait and watch. And so, for example, let's say you have a pair of bluebirds nesting in a bluebird box or something. Oh man, probably not a bluebird box, but they're just making a nest, right? Then the brown-headed cowbird will wait until both are off the nest. So this is typically
Okay.
before incubation. The female will head on in there. It will lay the egg, usually just one egg, and then it will leave. And at that point, yeah, it's pretty much done with that chick. We don't know if they remember where all the eggs they lay are. We're not entirely certain how many eggs they lay. We have a general guess as to maybe anywhere between 3 to 5 to 6 eggs, something like that. But we have heard I've heard anecdotal stuff that they can, potentially lay more than that. So we don't know if they're going back and checking up on them. Typically, it seems like not so much. The more that they would check up on them, the more you would think the parents might get a little suspicious. So they're kind of giving up visitation rights for the ability to not take care of them.
Love it. I love it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic strategy.
How is the
Now
cowbird population?
The cowbird population is pretty healthy, actually.
Pretty healthy.
I couldn't give you an exact number of how many there are out there, but they're doing just fine.
I bet.
And they're protected. They're native birds. They're protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, just like all other wild birds. So.
That's good.
So now, what about the magpie? Is it true that they steal nests, the magpie, or?
So I'm not entirely sure. For example, like the black-billed magpie or something like that. I'm not entirely certain. From what I know,
that there was one that did, but I don't know if it's that one or.
I'm not entirely. From what I know of some magpie species out west, that they do seem to build their own nests. But they might. I mean, I also wouldn't put it past corvid. They're pretty intelligent birds. So if you can find a nest that's not being used, or a nest that's currently abandoned because other things are out eating, and you can defend it and you don't have to build a nest, more power to you. Then you don't have to build a nest, right? I mean, you don't have to worry about all that. Now, admittedly, it would be silly to try to take an eagle nest or something. But if you can take a cardinal nest and it looks sturdy, might as well, right? Sure.
Very good. Okay, Harrison, one last question, then I'll shush up and let other. Would you say that the crow would be the smartest bird? I mean, for him to have protection or backup, I mean, it just sounds like the crow constantly baffles my mind with what they can do. Or
They're smart.
Crows, I think that crows are, again, it starts to get a little bit tricky here, but they certainly have the highest cognitive function, I think. So they are definitely absolutely amazing birds. So they certainly do things that other birds cannot do. A lot of species use tools. One species of crow make tools. They do a lot of things. They can play. They have really complex social dynamics within their flocks. They can memorize hundreds of other individuals based off of their calls and things like that. So they are really, really high cognitive functioning animals. So yeah, I would say that they're, as much as I love these burrowing owls and they look adorable, I wouldn't say that they're at the same level as a crow. They're certainly up there, but probably not the same level.
Thank you.
Of course.
I know we had a question from Beth in the chat. Beth, do you want to unmute and ask? Or I can read it. So it's about, she said the locust, will the locusts this year generate a great source of biomass? I think referring to the cicadas.
Yeah, I got myself unmuted, sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, that you asked the question, and then we did have a second one here, but I'm really curious if this would be considered a good year biomass way.
Absolutely, 100%. This is a fantastic year to be a baby bird. Chances are you are going to be fed and be fed very well. So what we're going to, more likely than not, what we're going to see is kind of the same thing, right? We tend to see these kind of oscillations revolving around food X. So what you have is this big, peak of cicadas, which means that this year we're going to have probably not necessarily more baby birds, right? The birds aren't necessarily going to lay more eggs, but what we'll see is a higher survival rate. So within the next year, what we're going to see is a lot more juvenile and hatchier birds. So we're going to see a lot of younger birds like these bobwhite, these northern bobwhites, survive into potentially adulthood, which is great. Now, admittedly, that means typically things tend to crash back down eventually because the food sources aren't there. So then within the next upcoming couple of years, you might have more nests that don't survive. But you're definitely going to see a lot more baby birds survive this year and into next year for sure, because there's going to be so many cicadas out there.
Very cool. If I could ask a second question, when birds migrate, and so they go from a warm weather maybe environment to another warm weather environment, or from one in which they are breeding, might they have two breeding stations, one in each hemisphere? Or does it tend to be cyclical where the migration serves a different purpose for them?
That's a great question. Typically, they do only have the one breeding area. And the reason for that is there's a lot of, it's varied. But typically, for example, let's say, again, let's look at maybe, an osprey that might migrate down to the Amazon and live there over the winter and then come up to the Chesapeake. The reason it's coming up to the Chesapeake isn't because it loves crabs and it likes Maryland, although I hope that it does. It's because there's less predators here. So typically they're migrating to breed someplace where it's safer. So that's why there's a lot of birds that migrate up north, way up north into the Canada, almost near the Arctic tundra, because there's way fewer predators up there. And there's a lot of insects. If you've ever been out to Alaska in the summer, oh boy, those mosquitoes will come after you. And so it is one of those things where when you leave the Amazon, right, it's hard to reproduce in the Amazon because there's just, the insects can kill you, right? Everything there can kill you, basically, especially for a baby bird. Not carpenter ants, army ants are a huge threat for any birds that are gonna, try to reproduce on the ground over there. There's just lots of things that are not great for nestlings and for chicks. So if you have the capability to migrate and go someplace where there's only a couple predators, let's say 2 or 3 compared to over 100, right? You're going to give your chicks way more opportunity to survive. So that's typically why they tend to migrate. And then they migrate down south again because there's, they run out of food. If they're eating insects up north and then all of a sudden it turns cold, the insects die off and you just don't have the food sources available. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of species that don't migrate because they can take advantage of all the food resources throughout the year. But typically, if you're going to migrate, you migrate someplace away from the equator to breed, and then you go back to the equator as an adult because you're much more able to survive.
Oh, thank you.
Harrison, real quick, the pictures that you're showing, can you share, I heard you say the burrowing owl and the bobwhite quail. Can you share the other
Sure.
birds?
So this is one of my favorite photos. This is an American oyster catcher that's been banded and is currently in the study. I tend to use a lot of the pictures of the precocial birds because they look cuter. They're much fluffier. So our northern bobwhites, our burrowing owl, our emperor penguin chick, which is adorable. This is a sandhill crane. which are, of course, fascinating birds. And if you've never been up to Nebraska, the Audubon Center's up there to take a look at them, I would highly suggest you do that. American robin, and again, one of our loons. And so, yeah, these are just some of my favorite. I love the waterfowl, especially, right, when they have all their babies on their back, are just super cute. There's just something about that that I really like.
Did you take these pictures?
I wish I took these. These are all from Audubon award-winning photographers.
Okay.
That's why I use them.
You could be a liar, if you wanted to.
I could. I take a couple of photos myself here and there, but I don't have the patience or the editing skills or anything like that to take photos like this.
Jeez.
But they are absolutely gorgeous, and so
They really are.
And so I have access to those websites that they're like, oh yeah, here's all the award winners, and I'm like, I will take those, thank you, please.
Yes.
All right. Roxanne, a question from Roxanne. Has there been any chit chat or concern about migrating birds are transferring COVID or any related viruses?
So that is a great question. When I was fresh out of college and I was doing work with DNR, one of the things that I was doing some work with was looking at, we were drawing blood from brown pelicans in the bay, looking for West Nile virus and H1N5, which is a strain of avian flu. So birds are vectors of some diseases, certainly. In terms of COVID, we do not believe that they are a reservoir or a vector for that particular disease, as far as we are aware of. Obviously, it's an evolving situation with more variants coming out. We aren't fully sure yet. But as far as we know, they are not spreading that particular disease. The diseases that we are mostly more concerned with is West Nile virus. That's a big one. Avian flu is of concern. However, typically West Nile virus spreads more readily because it's something that can transfer with mosquitoes as a vector, right? So mosquitoes bite an infected bird and they bite a person and that person becomes infected. Avian flu doesn't typically tend to work that way. That doesn't really have a vector like that. So you really have to be handling individual birds, which is why typically when we tend to see avian flu outbreaks, they tend to be around poultry farms, which isn't great for us here on the Eastern Shore with all the poultry farms. But unless you're going in and handling these birds without proper masks and things like that and gloves, if you're not doing that, you're probably going to be okay. Chances are you're not likely to catch it unless you're staring up somewhere at a bird and it happens to poop or something like that and it lands on your skin or something. It's a very, very, very unlikely chance that you're going to get it. There are other diseases like waterfowl can have really big cholera outbreaks that can kill a lot. Obviously, salmonella is a big problem as well if you eat undercooked birds, but that typically tends to happen if you're hunting and stuff like that. So wash your gear and cook your birds properly if you do hunt, and you'll be okay. But in terms of some of the other zoonotic diseases, they're very rare. They're typically a lot more in Southeast Asia and Africa. Here in North America, we're kind of blessed in that we don't have a ton of those zoonotic diseases currently in our bird populations. We are keeping track of those things, and there are scientists out there that do a lot of blood draws, and a lot of the bigger die-offs. If some of you have maybe heard last year in the Southwest, there was the big die-off of birds that we found that we pretty much thought it was because of the fires and pushing those birds out into the desert. And one of the things that scientists do when you find bird carcasses is basically an autopsy, and you look at kind of the cause of death. And so you will look at if it's a zoonotic disease or if it's from another animal, or if it's from poison, right? There was bald eagles that were poisoned here on the Eastern Shore, and so they figured that out because of autopsies and things like that. So there's a lot of people keeping track of it because it would spread really easily, right? If there's something that they catch in the Amazons or the Amazon, and they come up here and in the Chesapeake Bay, right? That's a really great way to spread disease. But thus far, it seems like we're mostly in the clear, so which is a good thing.
Yeah. Wow.
Any other questions? Well, we want to say thank you so much. And I did put a link in the chat to check out our next upcoming programs. We've got some great things lined up for later this spring and into the summer. And keep your eyes on that page because we're always adding more. So keep tuned into that. And of course, there's a link to support Pickering Creek's work if you would like to do that. And we're of course very grateful for all of those donations. They're all raised locally to make this work possible. Again, thank you so much. We will share the recording and some resources with you. We'll see you again soon, I hope.
Thank
you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Learned a lot.
Thank you, guys.
Wonderful.